Hello and welcome 8th graders to my lesson here on Chapter 7, Section 3, Challenges for a New Nation. This will correlate along with pages 243 through 249 in our textbook. And our IB unit question we'll be looking to answer as we go through it is how do leaders solve problems? So we'll be looking at especially our nation's very first elected leader, George Washington, in this section. And in addition to that, the men he put in charge to help him lead the nation. And we'll look at the new challenges they face from Britain, from France, from within their own people, and how they reacted and solved those problems as they came about. And then we'll close with Washington's departure from the presidency at a time when he could have probably served until he died, but he chose to lay down his power and leave after only 2 terms as president. Here we go. And among all of the challenges that the new United States faces, economic and internal divisions, really it's the third one, the divisions between France and Great Britain that come into play first here in this section. And we find over history that the United Kingdom, or Britain, and France are continually at war with each other. In July 14th, 1789, actually, these French citizens themselves rebelled against their own king. And as I said, July 14th, 1789, you can see here in the picture, the citizens of Paris attacked and captured the Bastille, a hated fortress and a prison. It stood as a mighty symbol of royal power. And I note here that it's this key first step in the French Revolution. And what it's going to do is it's going to really throw the American people into a bit of a conundrum here. I'm going to blow this up for you so you can see the picture a little bit. But do we support France, who supported us in the Revolution? Or is it more economically a good decision to support Great Britain, who is a key trading partner that we have? And as we saw in the last section, that debate between Hamilton, very more pro-British stance, economic stance, versus Thomas Jefferson, who had a more French stance, these two opinions are going to really butt heads as they try to solve this issue with this French Revolution and then with Great Britain. So as Americans looked across the Atlantic, they see this French Revolution looking a lot like their own. And they remember all the help that the French had given the Americans during the Revolution. And yet, some Americans start to get really worried about this whole revolution and its violence and attacks on the authority figures. And when finally they ended up beheading their king, King Louis the 16th in January 93, and their queen, Marie Antoinette, a few years later, a lot of Americans then started to say, you know what, maybe we should just remain neutral. And in the end here, Washington takes this very strong neutral stance in what is known as the Neutrality Proclamation. So Washington says in this Neutrality Proclamation that the U.S. is not going to take sides with any European countries that were at war. In fact, he goes to Congress on April 22nd, 1793, and he says, quote, "The duty and interest of the United States require that they should, with sincerity and good faith, adopt and pursue a conduct friendly and impartial towards the belligerent powers." And this was a really important first step for Washington to assert his powers as the U.S. president. In fact, some members of Congress, like James Madison, one of the founding fathers of our nation, really thought Washington had gone too far in just declaring this neutrality instead of going to Congress first. Nevertheless, the issue had been decided. So President Washington then has to deal with this French question. You know, how do we deal with the French now? So this guy here on the left, Edmond Junet, is the French ambassador to the United States, has been doing something that's really upsets Washington. He's hiring American sailors to help the French fight England in their continual war by commanding these privateers. And privateers, as you can see, are private ships hired by a country to attack its enemies. So the French are hiring these American sailors to fight their war against England, which makes neutrality a little bit difficult in the eyes of the English. They see American sailors fighting against them on the high seas, and they don't think they don't see us as being very neutral. Now, Jefferson here, still very, very pro-French, wants us to side with Junet and the French, thinks that's the right course of action, whereas Hamilton here continues to say a course of neutrality and eventually really a pro-British course, which Jefferson here sees as is his plan, continues to put these two gentlemen at odds. Again, the Secretary of the Treasury here and the Secretary of State in Washington's cabinet. Jefferson really just thinks Hamilton has way too much influence and power on the president, and in 1793, Jefferson here ends up resigning as Secretary of State. So he leaves the Washington cabinet, leaving Hamilton, Adams, and all the other Federalists the key political viewpoint in the new Washington administration. So President Washington has to turn his attention additionally to these two issues here, one involving Great Britain and one involving Spain, all again during his presidency here. Again, these are threats from afar that he has to deal with. So the first one, Jay's Treaty. Now, a treaty is this agreement between two nations, and what happens prior to the treaty being signed itself is that in the late 1793, so this is just after Thomas Jefferson has left the presidency, we're still dealing with trying to stay neutral with the French and English. The British will start seizing a lot of our ships carrying food to the West Indies. They were neutral American merchants. They weren't involved with the French or the English. And British officers are now arming and helping Native Americans fight settlers on the western frontier. So to avoid another war, Washington sends John Jay, who happens to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to negotiate this treaty. Now, this is something the Secretary of State would do today, deal with a foreign nation in this way, but then he sent John Jay. The British didn't want another war, nor did us, and so they come up with this in 1794, this treaty, this Jay's Treaty. It settles the disputes that had arisen between the U.S. and Great Britain. The British agree to pay damages on seized American ships, abandon all their forts in the northwestern frontier, and the U.S. agrees to pay its debts that it owes the British. Well, as you can see in this picture here, the people are not real happy. What this is some citizens back home in the United States burning John Jay here in effigy. Here's Jay, and it's a stuffed doll, obviously, and he's not actually being burnt. That's what burning in effigy means, burning a likeness of him. And so here's Jay, and they're burning him. They are unhappy. Violent protest, very unpopular. They thought we had conceded too much. It hurt our trade, didn't punish the British enough for some of their actions. Southerners, which is more likely where this scene here occurred, were especially angry. Treaty did not ask Britain to repay them for the slaves that Britain had set free during the Revolution, which is something that they had been very upset about, that the British had freed all these slaves. In Washington himself, to be honest, didn't like this treaty, but believed it was the best that could be done in keeping us out of a war. So turning our attention now to Spain and what is now the southern part of the United States, we're going to take a look at here Pinckney's Treaty. Let me blow up this map for you guys here. So the dispute going on down here in the south now is the border. So right here you can see Spain is owned by the Spanish at this point, and this area right here that's dark here, the Spanish are claiming this is theirs. We're claiming it's further south here along the 31st parallel, and so Washington needs to deal with it. In addition here, this key port of New Orleans, where you see the Mississippi rivers flowing down here, key port to get all of our goods out to the Gulf of Mexico and across the Atlantic into the West Indies. This port gets closed, so the Spanish close it off, and we have no way to get our goods down the Mississippi. So we send Ambassador Thomas Pinckney to meet with them, try to figure things out, give us the right to clear our goods through here, without paying exorbitant, cargo fees and things that the Spanish are trying to get out of us. So he sends Thomas Pinckney down there, and the Spanish minister down there, Manuel, de Gothoy, he tries to delay Pinckney here, hoping Pinckney's going to, try to sign a treaty that's not as good for the Americans. And the Spanish also are kind of worried that we might side with the British against Spain in this global conflict, since we had just signed this Jay's Treaty. But in fact, it didn't happen. Pinckney is patient. Patience is rewarded, and they sign in 1795 the Pinckney Treaty, which settles the border and trade disputes with Spain. Spain agrees to recognize the United States border right here at the 31st parallel, and it also reopens the port of New Orleans to American shipping and gave them the right of what's called deposits. So the right of deposit, we could deposit our goods out here in the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico. So as Washington, again, is dealing with these foreign situations, back at home, things are still unstable on the Western Front. So what you have is, considering here, kind of all along the Western Front of the United States, and we're kind of looking at a very zoomed-in portion here. You can obviously see Michigan. But on this Western Front, settlers are still moving this way, moving westward, trying to expand, get more land, and coming into contact with Native Americans. Native Americans that we've learned are being armed by the British. So, organized under this chief here, Miami Chief Little Turtle. Oops, I can't zoom him in there. But Miami Chief Little Turtle, they win some in 1790, 1791. The United States suffers some defeats against Little Turtle. And then the press puts in this guy, this gentleman here, U.S. General Anthony Wayne, puts him in charge, sends him out, and he gets out to Ohio here. We zoom this map in here. I'm going to zoom this in. But you get out to this Ohio region here. And so Anthony takes over. A lot of his men at the time, 1793 now, very sick from influenza and smallpox. They're unable to fight real well. They move north, build this fort here, Fort Greenville. So Wayne builds this fort. They remain during the winter, get additional supplies, and kind of gear up for the next summer. So the summer of 93 comes. Native American groups led by Little Turtle attack the supply train near the fort. Wayne and his men respond. They attack Native American towns and burn crops in this region. So the British no longer aid the Native Americans after the defeat. Little Turtle realizes that they're outmatched, and he urges his people to seek peace. So finally, in this one last battle here at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, you have Chief Little Turtle, who goes down in defeat against General Anthony Wayne, again, August 20th, 1794, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And this breaks the back of the Native Americans in the region, and the strength never really recovers after that in this area. So in the Treaty of Greenville, eventually is signed. Native Americans are forced into this, this treaty, which gives the United States claim to most Indian lands in all of the Northwest Territory. It also guarantees the safety of citizens there in the region. In exchange, Native Americans receive $20,000 worth of goods and an acknowledgement of their claim, the claim to the lands that they still held. And again, just one of the many times in history when Native Americans suffer defeats at the hands of the American government, and continued to lose their native homeland as Americans pushed westward. Also turning to situations at home, that we still have this crushing debt that we have to deal with, not unlike today. So what happens is in March of 1791, a tax on whiskey is passed as part of Alexander Hamilton, again Secretary of the Treasury's plan to pay off this federal debt. And he also was just curious to see, in testing, to see if the states would actually comply with this federal government law and the power of the Constitution, the power of Congress to levy taxes on its people and its states, like they hadn't under the Articles of Confederation. Remember Shay's rebellion? This rebellion is similar in the senses that you have farmers here who are going to try to assert their state or their local authority and claim that the federal government couldn't tell them what to do. So western Pennsylvania farmers, this time not Massachusetts, are furious. The government, they don't think the government's protecting them from Native American attacks. They are finding trade difficult because they're trading mainly corn. They're turning their corn into whiskey because it's a lot easier to transport. So they feel like this tax is a tax directly aimed at them. They feel it's personal. And whiskey became money in the region. And so it was almost like they were just taking their money away from them. So they rise up, they protest. In 1792, Washington issues this proclamation saying you have to obey the law. They didn't care. At first it was peaceful, but by 1794, the fighting breaks out in what becomes known as the Whiskey Rebellion. They lash out against the tax on whiskey. They refuse to pay the tax. They tar and feather collectors. Remember we talked about earlier in the year tar and feathering, and what a gruesome, painful thing it really is, as silly as it kind of sounds. And they call themselves the New Sons of Liberty, kind of taking control over this tyrannical big government. And these start to spread all over the United States. So Washington, again, starts to think, how do leaders solve problems? He had to solve the problem at this point. He needed to make sure that people understood the Constitution. It gave Congress the right to pass and enforce the taxes and other laws. And he also felt like it was threatening their power and threatening the fabric of the nation. So, as you can see in the red here, he personally, the President of the United States, personally leads this military action against the rebels in Pennsylvania, and his army of 13,000 men approached western Pennsylvania in November of 1794. The rebels flee. The Whiskey Rebellion actually ends without any kind of fighting at all, and really what it did was it's a show of power to the federal government. That's the key thing about this rebellion. It showed that the federal government had power to control the states, and it really asserted Washington's power, the president's power, and showed how Washington, the leader, solved the problem at the time. And then finally in 1796, when Washington was up for an additional term, because at this time there was no term limits like there are today, he decided to not run for that third term. When he could have continued on as president and continued to hold power, he just decided it was too much. He said, quote, he was tired of public life and, quote, devoutly wished for retirement. Being the general during the Revolution and being the president was something that Washington seemed to do with much, he knew he was needed for the country, but he did it with a lot of wariness, and he was unsure about his role, if he could do it well, and he really did want to just retire. So with the help of Hamilton and Madison, he writes his famous farewell address in 1796. The greatest dangers, he points out, are foreign ties and political conflicts at home. We need to stay away from tying ourselves to foreign nations and to staying out of conflict at home. Tying ourselves with other nations could draw us into war. Would said that disagreements in politics would weaken us, hated political parties, said they were dangerous, and that unity was the key to success. And he stressed that we needed to work out differences and stay out of debt. The government really shouldn't be borrowing money. And it's interesting how many parallels and foreshadowing of dangers that we see today in our government. Some of the same things, disunity, political parties tearing the country apart, and staying out of debt. All things that in 1796 it seemed Washington could foresee were going to be problems for our nation. Concludes his speech by looking forward to his retirement, praising his country, and says, I quote, I anticipate the sweet enjoyment of good laws under a free government, the ever-favorite object of my heart. And so ends the two terms of our first president of the United States, George Washington. And in looking back at it, we can see through all the different things he had to deal with, foreign and at home, how truly this leader solved the problems that we faced. Thanks a lot, guys.